I want to introduce you. You guys, this is Noe Marymor. She is with the in our office out of Greeley, Natural Resource Conservation Service. And she's a wildlife biologist with them who has to cover a fairly large portion of this state. And the NRCS, guys, we haven't talked too much about in this class. You've probably talked more about it in your wildlife management class. They are a federal agency that works with private landowners. So they are not necessarily land managers, like maybe the Forest Service, even Parks and Wildlife to some extent, but their primary role is to get the private landowners connected to conservation practices and to assist with that. So important role, and I'm sure also very challenging at times. And Noe, if you wouldn't mind giving kind of a brief overview of what you do in your job, that would be awesome.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here today.
Thank you for doing this.
Oh, glad to do it. And sorry I couldn't be there in person with everybody, but hopefully this will work doing the web deal. Yeah, so like Heather said, I do work for the NRCS, and I primarily work with farmers and ranchers out in eastern Colorado. So a lot of what I do is helping landowners take like poorly performing crop ground where they're not making a lot of money and plant that back to either wildlife habitat or true prairie restoration. We do a fair bit of wetland creation along the South Platte River, primarily for dabbling ducks that are migrating through. And then we do a fair bit of grazing management with landowners to help them be a little bit more in balance with their stocking rates on our native rangelands. And as part of that, we can help them kind of work in special wildlife considerations to how they graze. So leaving more cover over the winter into the spring for nesting prairie chickens and things like that. But it's a really fun job. I enjoy doing it, and am glad to share a little bit of species information that I've gleaned over the years with you guys today. Yeah, with that, I'll jump right in if you're ready, Heather.
That's good. Thank you for that.
Okay. Cool. Well, what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about birds. You know, what are they? Why do they matter? And then we're going to take kind of a deep dive into some species that occur here in Colorado. So the northern bobwhite, the wild turkey, and the snow goose. And we'll talk a little bit about their ecology and some of their management concerns. So first thing, this is probably a little bit of review for folks, but what are birds, right? So you think about it, and birds are kind of a crazy type of critter that's out there. Everything from little tiny hummingbirds to giant ostriches and emus. You know, we've got birds adapted to life in the water like penguins. We've got almost semi-aquatic birds like albatross, which barely ever come to land. So there's a huge range of life history strategies out there and different morphologies when we talk about birds. So, you know, kind of getting into the nerdy science look at them. So birds are in the kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Aves, right? So that's a lot of Latin. What does that mean? So essentially birds are vertebrates. They have feathers, they have wings, a bill, they're warm-blooded, and they lay eggs. So if you have a critter and it's got all of these attributes, you've got a bird. So that's their taxonomic definition. When we think about birds, though, there's some other ways of looking at them outside of just taxonomy and kind of those scientific goggles that oftentimes we use. There's also birds that are important in art and have cultural value. Birds have religious value to certain religions and certain cultures. Definitely here in the US, you know, we all see our freedom eagle and get kind of that patriotic feeling. So birds have, again, different cultural values. They have recreational and food values, just an example of some pheasant hunters up in North Dakota. And again, you know, recreational and aesthetic value. There's lots of folks that like to just go out and watch birds. That's a pastime for them, as they get a lot of joy out of just going and seeing what birds are around and what they're doing. So I think it's always important to put wildlife into the context of not just what they are scientifically, but what they mean to our society. So Birds show up in kind of the conservation world in a lot of different ways, but most recently, especially grassland birds and some forest birds have gotten a lot of attention for declining populations. A lot of that is due to habitat loss or habitat degradation, depending on kind of where you are in the US. But just know there's a lot of birds out there that are experiencing very steep population declines. So that's what keeps folks like me in business, folks like at Forest Service or BLM trying to improve habitat to support these populations. So we'll dive a little bit more into kind of the life history of a few birds, and we're going to start with one of my absolute favorites. So this is the northern bobwhite. All right, so what's a bobwhite? So it's a species of quail. These are tiny little guys. A big male is only going to stand about 10 inches tall, so really small birds. They weigh maybe 5 to 8 ounces. So you think 8 ounces is about half a pound. So again, very small little guys. They live in groups called coveys, so they're one of the birds that kind of get some of their own fun lingo. But when you think about them, kind of what functional role they play in their landscapes is that they are a prey species. So I like to think about, all the coyotes, bobcats, hawks, owls, the people that are out looking to kill these things to eat them. And when you look at their life history, I like to say quail are born looking for a place to die. They're just not long-lived, and pretty much everything kills them. So they have very high predation rates because there's this huge suite of predators out there that preys on these guys. When they're very young, so just hatched to about 2 months old, they're very susceptible to exposure. So cold temperatures or a heavy rainstorm can kill them. They have some issues with parasites, especially eye parasites, and occasionally they have some disease issues. So it's kind of nuts. So bobwhite quail, about 80% of them are going to die before reaching 1 year of age. So that's a huge percentage of the population. You think about that number and you're like, well, how does this species persist if 80% of the birds are dying before they can reach 1 year and reproduce? Well, it turns out these guys have a pretty neat reproductive strategy. So what they do is they kick out as many young as they possibly can. So every time a hen nests, she's going to lay between 12 to 14 eggs. In either the female or the male can incubate nests, which means that either one, if the male's on the nest, the female can go feed and maintain some body condition, and vice versa. Incubation lasts for about 23 days. Here in Colorado, these birds initiate their nest, so they start laying eggs around June 1st. And then the peak of hatching is about mid-July, is when we really start to see a lot of our quail chicks. So what's cool with these guys is, so they're laying a lot of eggs and they're hatching out a lot of young, but the hen can lay 1 to 3 nests a year, depending on the habitat quality that she's in. If she's in really poor habitat quality, or maybe it's a real droughty year, she might just lay 1 nest. But if she's in good habitat quality and she's in the right body condition, she can have up to 3 nests a year. So that's how this species is able to overcome that really high mortality rate by having a whole lot of young that they're putting out every year. These birds have some pretty cool breeding behavior. So in the spring, the males are going to get to like a really high bush or up in a tree, and they broadcast their famous bobwhite call. So that's where these birds get their name. So I'm going to try to play this video. Hopefully it comes through. And so it's a video of the male doing his territorial call. So that's the male bobwhite call in eastern Colorado, especially on the river bottoms. That's kind of one of the sounds of spring, is that Bob White call that you'll hear on the river bottoms. And it's a really good call. It just brought my cat into the room, so hopefully he doesn't jump up on the laptop. But, right, so when we look at where Bob White quail live in the U.S., they're primarily in the southeastern part of the country and into the Midwest. They're inhabiting grasslands, forests, and shrublands. Here in Colorado, we're on the very, very westernmost fringe of the range. They really don't occur west of eastern Colorado. Major river bottom areas, so on the South Platte River and the Arkansas, and to some extent on the Republican River. And then if you see the big polygon down in very southeast Colorado, down in Baca and Prowers counties, those birds have enough resources that they can actually live in the sand sage rangelands down there. They have enough shrubs with sumac and sand sage that they're off of the river bottoms down there. But this is just some pictures of the sorts of stuff that Bob White quail are associated with. So on that top left is a picture of a pollinator plot, or what we call an upland bird buffer. And I'll talk a little bit about the importance of forbs to these birds. And then in the southeast, these birds are really associated with pine forests. Then getting down into Oklahoma, Texas, southern Colorado, birds are really associated with shrublands, so mesquite shrublands, sand sage shrublands. These birds are what we call an early successional species. So they are very dependent on bare ground and on broadleaf forbs for their seed food source. The bare ground is important because you think about how small these birds are. When those chicks are hatched, they're about the size of a cotton ball on two toothpick legs, right? So that's tiny. So think about something that small, like moving around your lawn at home. Really hard for that small of an animal to push through thick cover. So these birds are very bare ground dependent. They can simply move around, pick up seeds, and catch bugs. So because of that, these birds are really associated with things like fire, with heavy grazing that's done in the right way, with tree thinning, and in crop areas with tillage practices. So these really need disturbance to get that bare ground habitat. They're also very tied to woody cover. So the picture there is of a plum shrub row. What these birds do at night is they form these little circles like you see on the left with all of their heads sticking out. And then they're making these little rings inside the bottom of shrubs, so like up against the base. And then they all kind of doze, kind of like keeping watch. There's always a couple that are awake, a couple that are asleep. So they can keep an eye out for predators. And one way that they avoid predators is if something does come into that tree row, a coyote or a fox to chase them, they'll bust out in different directions to confuse that predator. And then once the threat is gone, they start calling to each other to regroup. But that woody cover with whatever species it is very critical for these escape areas and these kind of roosting and loafing areas for these birds. If you don't have woody cover, you won't have Bob White quail. So, what do these guys eat? The chicks, when they're really tiny, if you think about it, they're just putting on bone and muscle, so they need a lot of protein. So they're eating primarily insects, little soft-bodied insects. The juveniles and the adults, they've pretty much switched to just seeds. So they're eating seeds of plants like ragweed, crotons, some of the forbs that we have, some grass seed, and then crop seed. You know, like if they're near a cornfield, they'll happily pig out on corn. So thinking about the conservation concerns, these quail are basically a national species of concern. They're declining pretty much everywhere that they occur. And it's definitely a habitat issue because these birds are so sensitive to habitat condition. So the declines are a little bit, the cause of them are a little bit different depending on where you are in the US. But generally it's that their habitat has become late cereal. So they've lost that bare ground. They've lost a lot of the annual plants that they're dependent on. So that might be due to fire suppression. It might be grazing that's incompatible with their life history. It might be weed control with herbicides in a cropland setting. A lot of those weeds are really good quail food. Here in Colorado, we've lost a lot of our native grasslands and also our restored grasslands. So this is a picture of a restored grassland that was on the ground for about 20 years and then got plowed out to be turned back into a cornfield. This is very, very common in eastern Colorado right now. So without these fields, we don't have the cover for the birds out. So some of the conservation efforts for these guys is to plant back those grasslands that these birds need. This is a picture of a planting in Phillips County, Colorado. And you can see there's a lot of forbs in this picture and a lot of bare ground. So we designed these plantings just for these birds. We're also trying to do what we call cubby headquarters. So it takes a while for us to plant native shrubs and for those shrubs to get big enough for quail to use. So there's different designs for artificial structures that we can use in place of shrubs. So this is an old utility spool structure. You can see the utility spool there on the right, and we just covered it with branches. So there's enough branches that the quail can move in and out of there very easily, but it's a lot harder for a coyote. So that's quail for you. We'll shift a little bit into quail's giant cousin, which is the wild turkey. So both turkeys and quail, they're all in kind of the chicken family if you look at bird taxonomy. But wild turkeys have a very different life history strategy than their little cousins, quail. So wild turkeys have several subspecies across the United States. There's 5 of them. It's kind of neat here in Colorado. We have 2 of those subspecies. We have the Rio Grande wild turkey and the Merriam's wild turkey. But there's also the eastern in the eastern U.S. The Osceola is down in Florida, also called the Florida wild turkey. New Mexico and Arizona going into Mexico have the Gould's wild turkey. And then if you look at the Yucatan Peninsula there in Mexico, that's actually a different species of turkey called the Osceolated, which is a pretty cool one. So not a subspecies, it's a separate species entirely. But just a little bit of information. Typically these subspecies, the differences between them are the colors of the tail fans and some of the feathers tips towards the base of the back going into the tail. And then also the body size. So like the Merriam's turkey that we have here is one of the smallest turkey subspecies, whereas the Eastern is a really giant one that can get, 26, 28 pounds. If you get a 20-pound Merriam, that's a pretty big one. So this just goes through some of the difference between those subs. And then just so you know, the domestic turkey or your Thanksgiving Day turkey is the exact same species as the wild turkeys that are out there. The domestic ones, they come in 2 colors, basically bronze, which is the same coloration as a wild turkey, or a white, which you've probably seen on farms or on TV. So just so you know, exact same bird. This is just a domesticated version. So a little bit about kind of the morphology of these guys. So these numbers, like I said, there's a lot of subspecies out there. So this is just kind of the average of all of those. So they're going to be in the 18 to 22 pound average. I said some of the big male eastern turkeys can get up to 28 pounds. These birds stand 2.5 to 3 feet tall, so really big birds. The adult males are called gobblers or toms. So these guys have a beard, which you can see sticking out from this guy's chest. They have really long spurs right above their toes, kind of towards the base of the leg, which are used for fighting. They have a snood, which I just think is the coolest term in the world. That's the little appendage that's coming off right above this guy's beak. They're also darker than the females, so they're almost black, and then a much bigger body size. So a Jake is a 1-year-old male, so basically a juvenile male. So they still have a beard, but it tends to be just like 2 or 3 inches long. It hasn't really grown out yet. They're black like the gobblers. And their heads don't change colors quite as vibrantly as the full adult males do. The hens are a much lighter brown color, and their head is going to be a gray. So the hen's head will never change to white or red like the male's heads will. And then they're a little bit smaller bodied as well. When we look at their breeding behavior, again, here's a bird with a really cool display. So these birds travel around in groups in the spring, anywhere from 1 to 10 males with, depending on where you're at, 1 to 30 females. Just depends on the size of the flock and where they're at in their breeding chronology. But these males put on a strutting display, and that display lasts for about 2 or 3 months. It starts about mid-March and will go to almost the end of May. So this is a picture, or sorry, a video of this strutting behavior in the gobblers. And what they're doing is they find females. Typically, females are just wanting to feed and be left alone. But these guys totally open up their tail fan and they puff up. You can see these guys are totally puffed up. And then they'll actually drag their wingtips on the ground. So you can see with this bird, his wingtips are touching the ground. So he'll walk and drag those wings. And towards the end of the spring, the wingtips are totally rubbed off. So I've got several wings from birds that I've taken, and all the tips of their wings are sheared off from doing this breeding display. They'll also make kind of a spitting and drumming noise. I don't think on this video you can hear the spitting and drumming very much, but these birds will do this literally for days. The males almost don't eat in the spring. They lose a whole lot of their body weight going into the breeding. They have pretty good fat reserves, but by the end of it, they're hurting pretty good. Their fat reserves are depleted, and they're weighing a lot less because they spend their time just doing this display instead of feeding. All right, let me see if I can. All right, there we go. So the reproductive strategy for these guys, so these birds start breeding a lot earlier in the year. The hens are going to start sitting on nests in mid-April. So they're going to be starting, there's hens on nests now. We're getting into that peak nest initiation. Hens are going to lay 1 egg a day for 10 to 12 days. And then once she's laid that last egg, then she's going to sit on the nest for about 22 days until that whole nest hatches out. Unlike quail, these birds are only going to raise 1 brood a year. So they're not going to try to nest over and over again and try to get multiple clutches, which is what we call kind of a hatched out nest. These birds will re-nest if the first nest is destroyed. So say if a predator comes, maybe a skunk comes and eats all the eggs, she'll go and re-nest if she has time. But once she has that 1 brood and they're hatched out, she's done for the year. She's going to focus on raising those chicks. Here in Colorado, peak hatch is about June 1st for these guys. So habitat requirements, turkeys need trees for roosting. So, a lot of times they're associated more with grasslands, but there has to be at least a few trees around for them to get into at night. So they're going to sleep up in the tops of trees to get away from predators. They nest either in thick grass, in shrubs, or behind downed logs. So they want a little bit of cover for nest protection. Then they're going to eat forbs, which is just any kind of leafy herbaceous material, and insects. So kind of similar to chicks. Once their nests hatch out, those chicks need just insects for that protein content. So they really feed hard on chicks in the spring. And then the adults, they will eat grasshoppers, any kind of insect that they can catch, but they're really more focusing on masts, so things like acorns in southern Colorado, or seeds. They eat a lot of ponderosa pine seeds in Colorado, a lot of grass seeds. So just a picture of our roosted birds up in a tree here. So depending on your subspecies, these birds can be very dependent on forests. So on the left is kind of what we would expect more in the eastern US. On the right is a Merriam's bird in a ponderosa pine forest. So they're looking for forests that still have a pretty good grass understory to really be able to roost well. So forest habitat quality impacts these birds quite a bit. They also really like edges. They're an edge species. So if you look at that picture on the right, you've got a nice riparian area with a lot of trees. So you get that roosting habitat, but there's really close access. You see the crop fields kind of along the county road there at the bottom. So they really like being able to move between habitat types easily. So turkeys are considered kind of a major conservation success in the United States. So these birds were almost entirely killed out of the country by the 1930s. And that was due to long-term, what we call unregulated subsistence and market hunting. Because these are the same as your Thanksgiving Day turkey, these things taste really good. So they were killed just by homesteaders for basically meat for themselves, and then also by folks that were going out and trying to kill as many of these as they could and then shipping them to cities to be sold in market. There was also loss as eastern forests were converted to cropland. As the country was first settled, they lost a lot of that forest habitat that they needed for nesting. So, none of us were here before European settlement, but some of the estimates in the literature think that there was about 10 million birds before the country was settled by Europeans. And then by the 1930s, that was down to maybe around 200,000 birds. So when you think about a bird that has a national kind of countrywide distribution, going from 10 million to 200,000, these birds were very, very few and far between. Luckily, they've responded really well to management. So once market hunting was shut down and hunting regulations limited how many of these birds could be killed in a given year, that took a lot of the pressure off the populations, and state fish and wildlife agencies started trapping wild birds and moving them around into new habitat to try to repopulate them, and it worked really, really well. So today we think there's about 6 million turkeys, and they are not just in their historic range, but also into what we would call new ranges, where they didn't occur previously, but they're adapted to areas now. So they're actually such a good kind of conservation success story that there's some parts of the US, especially in the eastern US, where they're considered a nuisance species because there's so many of them. They're roosting on people's cars and on their roofs. And so folks kind of get sick of having them around. So that's a big change when you go from almost entirely killed out to now there's so many of them that they can be a pest. So very, very big success story. Probably or maybe. So we do have some concerns with these birds right now. So what we've seen is really dramatic declines in wild turkey populations, especially in the southeastern United States since about 1990. Kansas has always been considered kind of one of the wild turkey strongholds in the US. They've just had to significantly cut back how many wild turkey hunting licenses that they will give out every year because they've had really dramatic declines in that state. So there's a lot of wildlife managers starting to take notice and say, okay, there's something wrong with our turkey populations. What are we going to do about it? So some populations have shrunk by as much as 50%. In the southeast, it's probably due to habitat quality loss and degradation with our southeastern forests. The forests are just getting so old and they have so little disturbance that there's just not a lot of grass or understory plants to actually feed these birds and provide nesting habitat. In the Midwest and places like Kansas, it's more due to we've lost a lot of conservation reserve program lands, which are restored grasslands. Those have been plowed up and gone back into crop production. So we just don't have the grassy areas for these birds to nest. So in the last probably really 10 to 15 years, there's been a really big renewed interest in research on wild turkeys. We always thought this was one of the species that we kind of knew a lot about and didn't really need to study very hard. But because of these declines, you're seeing a lot more research come out of universities on wild turkeys right now. So the last bird that I want to touch on is the snow goose, another Colorado bird that we have here. So looking at these guys, so these guys have crazy taxonomy, and I would not expect you to ever remember all of this. So I'll try to simplify it for you. So goose species have a whole bunch of genetic variability within a species. So they're often classified not just into subspecies, but then distinct populations within a subspecies. So geese have really complicated taxonomy. So with snow goose, well, there's a lesser subspecies and a greater subspecies. So for example, in the lesser subspecies, there's a Wrangel Island population, a Western Arctic, and a mid-continent. For our discussion today, we're just going to talk about the mid-continent population of lesser snow goose. Because, like I said, they all come in so many different sizes, color variations. Taxonomy is something that I like to leave for the specialists. All right, so when we're talking about snow goose, here's a picture of one here. So adults are going to weigh about 6 pounds. So not as big as like a big Canada goose, but bigger than a small little tiny cackling goose. They've got about a 3-foot wingspan. They're very long-lived, and then they come in 2 color phases. So this one here is a white regular snow goose. This guy is what we call a blue phase or a blue goose. So you'll hear people talk about blue goose. It's not a separate species. It's just this dark blue phase snow goose. So the distribution of these guys here in North America, so they breed in the high Arctic. So the red color that you see kind of the north slope of Alaska, Canada, and then going in to the Arctic islands is their breeding ground. So pretty hardcore for these guys, not an easy place to make a living. And they migrate through our typical waterfowl flyways, which is the yellow areas on the map. And then they're wintering primarily in Kansas, Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, down in the Gulf. And then we have a fair bit that are here in Colorado that are winter. And then they'll go into Mexico as well for wintering. So these birds are covering basically all of North America every single year. So in terms of their breeding ecology, so these birds are monogamous either for life or until the loss of a partner. So if one of the partners dies, they'll reform a bond. If they can, they'll maintain the same mate for the length of their life. So breeding occurs in spring during their northern migration. These birds don't breed till they're 2 or 3 years old. With turkeys and quail, they're breeding at 1-year-old. These guys might not breed till 3-year-old. They form these giant colonies up in the Arctic for nesting. This picture, it's basically snow goose pairs with nests as far as the eye can see. So those nesting colonies might be a few hundred birds or up to 100,000 birds in a nesting colony. Really crazy when you think about how many birds are in one spot. So the female is going to lay 3 to 5 eggs, and then the female incubates and the male basically stands watch and is going to guard the nest from nest predators like Arctic fox and some of the other predators that they've got up there. In terms of their food habitats, these guys are herbivores. They're feeding in different types of shallow wetlands, depending on where they're at. So tidal marshes, sedge meadows. They will use crop waste residue though. So they feed a lot in cornfields, sometimes on wheat fields. They'll use that high protein seed as well. They'll eat grasses, sedges. They'll also grub. So one of the issues that we'll talk about a little bit later is some of the damage they can do through extensive grubbing. So they're basically pulling up plants to get to the roots and the tubers on the bottom of that plant, the underground portion. So we'll talk a little bit about the migration. So again, these guys, they're breeding in the high Arctic and then going all the way, into Mexico for their wintering ground. So it's a lot of ground for them to cover, flying back and forth. So they're typically leaving the breeding areas around August. When they go back north really depends on snow melt. They basically make short little hops going north. They get as far north as they can. If things are still iced and locked up, they're going to stay by open water, and then as things melt out, they continue north. These birds don't do anything alone. So they migrate in really large flocks, anywhere from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of birds migrating in a flock. They do use traditional staging areas. So a lot of our national wildlife refuges in the Midwest are big snow goose staging areas that they kind of show up kind of like clockwork every year. What's interesting is kind of how this bird's migration ecology has changed. So we think that before there was extensive ag development in the Midwest, so all the corn basically that we have throughout the middle part of the country, these geese probably made their southern flight in maybe 1 flight, maybe 2. They were basically picked up from the Arctic. There was nothing for them really in terms of food resources in the Midwest, at least nothing major. So they just tried to zoom to coastal areas down in Texas and into Mexico and feed in those marshes on the Gulf Coast. Well, as corn became king in the Midwest, now there's a new food source on the ground. And so now these birds winter, like we were talking here in Colorado, into Kansas, Arkansas, primarily relying on corn and waste grain. And they're very slow to migrate now because they can make so many stops and eat on the way down. So on the wintering grounds, these birds are typically roosting at night on really large bodies of water, so large reservoirs or on the Gulf. And then during the day, they fly out typically to agricultural fields, and they're feeding on that waste grain during the day. They've got some pretty important conservation and management concerns associated with these species. So we had talked about some of the other birds, how bobwhite quail are declining, turkeys were almost extirpated and came back. These species, snow goose, have only increased. So they haven't just increased, but it's kind of been an exponential growth. So our winter counts, there's big winter waterfowl counts across the United States every January. And from 1950 to 2001, there was a 230% increase in how many snow geese were being counted. And this is pretty much entirely due to the fact that these birds are living off of corn in the winter, so they're in really good body condition. And then there's a lot of areas where they can't be hunted. So it's really hard for us to put any kind of pressure on these birds to drive their populations down. So snow goose populations have actually exploded in recent years. This is a cool picture. So just to give you an idea of the scope of how many birds can be traveling in a flock, this is what's called a snow goose tornado. So this is one flock of snow geese that is attempting to land in a field. When you're out on the ground, this sound is absolutely deafening. So, this is tens of thousands of snow geese that are all trying to land in one spot. This is simply one flock. So when we talk about increases in snow goose populations, you can see what we're talking about. There's a lot of them. And what does this mean? Well, this is a picture of the Arctic, of a exclusion fence, so that snow geese cannot get inside of the fence. And outside, basically the tundra has been pretty much destroyed because of this extensive grubbing from all of the birds that are in these really small areas in the Arctic. They're up there to nest, but they're doing all that grubbing and pulling to eat. And what happens when they pull up so much ground, it makes the soil very susceptible to erosion. So when they do get snow melt in the spring, that snow is washing away the top layers of soil. So you get portions of the high Arctic that are totally denuded of vegetation simply because of this overpopulation of snow goose. So this is a pretty huge management concern in northern areas right now. So to try to get at this, there's what we call a snow goose hunting conservation order. It's probably a little odd to hear, that hunting conservation order all in the same sentence. But the idea is we want to try to drive down these snow goose populations. And the only way to do it is to kill as many as we can. So about 15 years ago, this conservation order came into play, and it basically took any regulation off of snow goose hunting. So it allows snow goose hunting into March, whereas before the regulation that ended in February. It allows the use of electronic calls, which are typically a no-no in almost every kind of hunting, but it lets that call be broadcast louder and more accurately to bring the birds in to where the hunters are. No bag or possession limits during this conservation order, so it's literally shoot as many as you can. And also no plug shotgun. So typically you can only have 3 shots in a shotgun for bird hunting. With this conservation order, as many rounds as the shotgun can hold is what you can have in the gun. So there's people that buy basically extension magazines to hold up to 10 rounds so they can just keep shooting when these flocks come in. So when you have that big tornado come in over your field, you can take as many birds as possible. The problem is that even with this incredibly liberal harvest, we've been able to slow the expansion of the snow goose population. We have not been able to reduce it at all. So one of the quotes that I found going through the snow goose literature was that simply the reproductive capacity of the species exceeds the ability of existing number of hunters to exert a harvest pressure that is necessary to impose sufficient additive mortality and thus effectively influence population growth. So we can slow down the expansion, but we can't stop it and we can't drive it down. So even though the conservation order is probably, slowing how bad the problem is, it's not addressing the problem in a significant way. And we'll just have to see kind of what happens in the future of snow goose management. There's a lot of folks at Fish and Wildlife Service that are scratching their heads going, what do we do with this species? How do we protect those high Arctic breeding grounds? So that's kind of that deep dive look at all these species. Just to kind of cover or reiterate, some of the stuff that we covered. When we talk about birds, huge diversity in the types of birds and their life histories. I just talked about three, kind of common birds here in Colorado, but that's not even the tip of the iceberg when we talk about the species that are out there and the strategies that they use to survive. So looking at bobwhite, they're tied to those really early successional areas that are driven by disturbance. They're very short-lived in terms of their lifespan, but they kick out a ton of young. So wild turkey are more of kind of that intermediate kind of a life history strategy. So they can inhabit a whole range of habitat types. They live kind of that moderately long lifespan of 5 or 6 years, and they can produce kind of a moderately large number of young. Then we look at snow geese, which is a very long-lived bird. They don't kick out near as many young, but they have very high survival rates and they have very good food sources that help support that survival. And so, they're fairly overpopulated right now. There's 3 different birds with 3 different strategies. And because, I kind of work in the habitat and the conservation end of things, I always like to reiterate that, birds need our attention. Northern bobwhites are in decline nationwide because of that lack of grassland habitat and lack of disturbance in their forested and other habitats. Turkeys, even though they're arguably one of the most successful conservation stories in the country, they're on the decline again, and they need a lot of attention to figure out how to, just keep the species going. If managers are having a hard time keeping a bird as common as wild turkey on the ground, that means that we're also losing for a whole range of songbirds, small mammal communities that are living in the same areas that turkeys live in as well. And then we've got, our snow geese that, because of being supported by agricultural food, are entirely overpopulated. And we're really struggling to figure out how to manage those birds so that they don't destroy the Arctic areas that they're in. So that's what I had for you guys today. I appreciate y'all hanging in there with me, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Fire away, you guys. Unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, I got a question. Is there any connection to the wild turkey decline with the overpopulation of snow geese taking over croplands?
No, not really. It's a good question. There's not an issue there because there's so much waste grain. I mean, turkeys are feeding on that same waste grain as the snow geese are in the Midwest for sure, but they're separated by the breeding habitats. Those snow geese are totally gone in the spring when turkeys are nesting. So, the turkeys are nesting in grasslands or forests down here, and those snow geese are up in the high Arctic. So, if we ever had a situation where you had something that was that overpopulated and they were on the same nesting ground, you'd probably have and you'd have some problems, but with that spatial separation, they're good to go. Question.
So what other species are being impacted then by the snow geese population expansion? Because I assume it's not just habitat degradation in the nesting grounds. I assume that those impacts are felt throughout the flyway and even down in southern parts.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a whole suite of species that are these high typical and waterfowl. So there's a whole suite. There's a bunch of subspecies that are in so breeding in the same areas. And I sure on them because they also be working in the Arctic, but they've got that habitat degradation. There's also lots of breed on the and are doing the same by the Midwest and southern areas. A lot of that want to be breeding on slope of Alaska, North Slope, Canada, uh, that really good habitat up there. In terms of competition kind of on the wintering grounds, we don't see that as much because they spend a lot of time on the really big reservoirs or on the Gulf Coast. So they seem on the winter migration areas to coexist with goose and like sandhill cranes pretty well. And like I said, there's so much corn in the Midwest for them that there's not really a competition for that corn resource with other species. The pinpoint's the breeding ground.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yep.
I was going to ask, what does it take for those grasslands that have been made for conservation to be turned back into agricultural lands?
Yeah, great question. So most of those grasslands are in a program called the Conservation Reserve Program. And it's a program that my agency administers. And what we do is we rent out a crop field for 10 years at a time. And we're paying that for every single year to keep that field in grass. What happens is at the end of that 10-year contract, the landowner can reevaluate whether or not we're paying him enough or if he would make more money going back into cropping that field. And what we've seen is our agency is paying less and less for those rental rates. And even though corn prices really aren't phenomenal, there's a lot of producers that are deciding I can make more money out of cropping those fields than I can by doing this government program. So that's why we're seeing all these fields ripped out. If our programs were paying more, then we would see more of these fields retained. You know, at the end of the day, the farmers have to make some kind of income off of that land, right? They need their annual income. They've got to make land payments. You know, they basically have mortgages on this land. So they have to have some kind of income. So Colorado Parks and Wildlife has a program for kind of smaller crop fields that are in dryland wheat that are in really high value upland bird areas. So kind of the eastern tier of counties for Colorado. And they track crop prices and try to make a point to pay about $10 more per acre than what a landowner could make off of farming to encourage the planting of really high quality grasslands and then maintaining those. They can only do those on 5-year contracts. So that's been really well received just because they pay so much on a per acre basis. Can't do thousands and thousands of acres because it's a really expensive program, but they can pick focal areas and really target those dollars. So like in Phillips County, Colorado, you know, in terms of outside of the Sandhills region, really the only grass that's on the ground right now is either these CPW rental areas or a few really old CRP fields that haven't been torn out yet.
These are good questions. What else?
Sure, I'll go. So when you're evaluating a habitat for restoration, how much do you take into account wildlife species that are maybe already using that habitat as it is, and then how those alterations will impact other species maybe that you want to attract to that habitat?
Nice. Yeah, that's fantastic. So we definitely play into that. Most of the restorations that we're doing, so we're either starting from crop fields that a landowner just isn't making money on anymore. And we look at that, even though there's some food value from whether it's corn or wheat or whatever, you know, that that winter food value is never population limiting. So if we see a crop field, we're basically, that's like ground zero. You can't get any worse than that. So that's really where we focus our time. We do take some older restored grassland fields that are like 20 years old, and they were never planted with really good seed mixes. So they might have only been planted with 5 species, and they've sat for so long. They're typically a monoculture of just one grass species. So there's no forbs. So those fields are, you know, they might have like a few small mammals in them, but they don't really offer good cover for any wildlife out there. So we'll take those fields and totally rip them out, take them back to dirt, and then we replant with really high diversity mixes that have like 25 to 30 plant species in them. And we design those to be good for upland birds, songbirds, pollinators, small mammal communities, and mule deer. And so, you know, we do like, we wouldn't take an older field if it's got like really good grass in it, and maybe it's just lacking some of the broadleaf plants. You know, we don't want to, destroy the value that it has. Some of those older fields, if they have good grass, you know, they're important for mule deer, fawning areas. You know, you can get some winter value from like prairie chickens. So for those, we'll just very lightly disturb those with tillage and go back and just interseed some of the wildflower, those forb species that we want to see, so that we can keep what we have and just enhance it a little bit. But yeah, if we've got something that's serving a purpose, we don't want to totally destroy it. You know, we kind of want to start with the worst of the worst and make it better. And luckily, there's plenty of those out there for us to work on.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Noe, could you clarify the concerns with snow geese is specific just to snow geese and not Canada geese as far as ripping up the tundra? But how have Canada geese populations been altered or impacted, I guess, by more cropland, more reservoirs, the human modifications to the landscape?
Yeah, so depending on which population of Canada goose you're talking about, some are doing really well, some are in decline. It just depends on where they originate in the Arctic and then where they're wintering. So like we have a population of Canada goose called the short-crest prairie population. And it's one that, you know, they're not nosediving by any means, but they are one of management concern. Just because we're losing some of the wetland habitat in the Midwest that they're dependent on. But then on the flip side, you look at like Fort Collins and the Front Range, we have a lot of these urban geese now. So they're resident geese. Those are birds that are born in city parks. They're feeding all summer on golf courses and then wintering on corn, you know, along I-25. And then, you know, they're going to nest back in that same city park where they were born. So those urban geese can cause a lot of conflict and damage, because people don't like walking down the sidewalks on goose turds, especially with golf courses. I really don't like having high numbers of geese around. So the Fish and Wildlife Service and states will, it's kind of hard in their framework to do, but they try to alter their hunting season dates a little bit to make them earlier so that the pressure is on the local urban geese that are resident and not necessarily the migrating geese that are coming in that can sustain harvest, but we don't want to put extra pressure on them. So like here in the Front Range, we do have a season that's just targeted at these northern Front Range, Fort Collins, Denver city geese. And then that season ends a little bit earlier to take the pressure off of the migratory shortgrass prairie population geese that are just coming in. They winter here. The big flocks that you see, more like around Greeley, Eaton, down to Johnstown, those are more of the migrating flocks. If you've seen, they're pretty much all gone now, but there's a really tiny Canada goose called the cackling goose, and they occur in giant flocks. Those are one that we, you know, again, aren't of huge management concern, but we want to make sure that we're not over harvesting them. So that's one, again, that we try to protect when they're here in the state. They can sustain some harvest, but not a ton.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Anything else, you guys?
That conservation hunting order that you talked about, Was that
Mhm.
unique to Colorado or is that a multi-state effort?
Yeah, that's a multi-state effort. So all waterfowl are actually managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service under a nationwide plan. So states get together by their flyways. So like we coordinate with Wyoming, with the Dakotas, with New Mexico, Kansas, and basically they set their hunting regulations. All those states have to agree. And so all the states coordinate their hunting seasons together. They coordinate their bag seasons together so that we can manage those populations on that continental scale. And so that's how the snow goose conservation order is managed. So all of the states have to coordinate. And on the conservation order, they're pretty much all, the season dates are a little bit different, like when you get up into the Dakotas, because they're just migratory up there, they're a little bit longer. Colorado to Kansas and Texas, because that's more of the winter range. But yeah, all those states are coordinating, and then it's managed at a federal level.
So since that's not really working, what do you see as the next step for trying to mitigate that problem of population expansion?
So, I don't know. Some folks have talked about, is there a way to control them on the breeding ground? Because obviously it's not really working for us to hunt them on the winter ground or when they're migrating. So, you know, they're sitting tight when they're in the Arctic. What's hard about that though is that you do have all these other species that are in the area that are nesting. So, you know, like these birds would probably be susceptible to some poisons, but we can't go out and spread a poison for them because we don't want incidental take on Canada goose, or we don't want biomagnification getting into Arctic foxes or, you know, some of the other species that are up there. So my guess is that control is ultimately going to have to happen on the nesting grounds, but I'm not enough of a waterfowl expert to know what exactly that would look like.
Okay, anything else, folks? Lisa, nothing from you? All right. Excellent presentation, huh, guys? Yes, this kind of worked. I've got 4 people streaming in my house at once, so there's always some challenges there, but I heard 99% of it, so I think that worked for me at least. I'm gonna I'm recording this and then I'll post it to your D12 site so you can watch it if you missed parts of it. But let's just thank Noe for a minute. So either virtually give her a round of applause or unmute yourself and let her know that you appreciate her taking time out of her day.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
Thank you. I have one more actually, if you have time.
Of course.
What do you see as the maybe best thing that we as students can do to prepare ourselves for a role like yours?
Oh, awesome. Yeah, that's the best question of the day. Um,
Thank you.
I would say really focus on getting some foundational knowledge on species ecology and habitat use. Um, you know, if you're interested in going into, you know, wildlife management, habitat management, maybe like a technician position, you know, really understanding what these species are doing, what their behaviors are, why are they occurring, where they occur, and then how you can either manipulate those populations or that habitat to reach the objectives that you're trying to get to is really important. Um, you know, there's a pretty big split in the wildlife profession right now between kind of theoretical wildlife management and research and then the on the ground folks. You know, we need a lot of research, but the researchers don't tend to understand the managers and the managers don't tend to understand the researchers. My bias, because, you know, I'm doing the on the ground stuff, is to encourage folks to really understand these species, get to know them, Don't just read like scientific papers on them. Go spend time, you know, bird watching, hunting, spend time with these species in their habitats as much as you can, and really learn to be an observer. You know, a lot of the old style naturalists, George Bird Grinnell and Aldo Leopold, they just spent a lot of time watching animals, learning their behavior, learning what habitats they wanted to be in and why. And once you have that kind of knowledge, then you can say, well, okay, so if I plant this kind of grass instead, or if I restore a wetland here, I think I'll get this result. And so that's what I would encourage folks to do is really be an observer, spend time getting to know the species, and learn to be a naturalist. Don't just rely on the scientific papers or you've got great teachers, but don't even just rely on them. Go and really build that knowledge for yourself. Use this sort of stuff as a springboard, but don't take it as the be all and end all.
Thanks, Noe. I couldn't have paid you money to say how much they should be working on their species profiles, more than your little comments right there, right? You guys thought that was busy work, but if you actually, learn from it, you're prepared for those jobs.
For sure. And hey, in the world of social distancing, this is a great year to go out by yourself and just watch wildlife, right? It's something that you can do and be safe. So we're going into a nice time of year to go and watch ducks migrating. There's great duck watching right now. I'm partial to just sitting and watching dabbling ducks for hours. So it's prime time on migration.
It's probably the best stress reducer ever is to just go sit and watch wildlife or listen. Jesse, I like your comment that you're listening to turkeys right now. That's exciting.
That's awesome. I'm jealous.
Me too. I'm in my cold basement all day where my computer can be plugged in.
Mhm.
Keep gobbling back at them too, and I'll get them to call back to me every once in a while.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. All right. Any last questions? George, are you all out?
I mean, I'm sure I could come up with more, but that,
Heather has my contact info. Any of you all are welcome to call or email me if you've got more questions or would like to visit more.
thank you.
All right. Let's thank you very much, Noe. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
I'm gonna use this opportunity to give them a couple more heads up regarding the class. So you are free to
All right. I'm
leave
gonna
it
log out.
or stay either way, but it probably won't apply to you. Thank you. So the rest of you guys, I said this at the beginning, but there's been a lot more people join, and I need to give you some more details. You have a quiz today. We're going to try this online quiz. It is not open note, all right? It is species ID. I'm trying my best to make it as much like the classroom quiz as possible. So you'll have to go through and give me the common name for a species, and then you'll have to go through and match the common name to the scientific name. I checked before class and it looked like George had taken it. Did it work okay for you, George?
Yeah, I think so, except for it looked like I missed one, which I wasn't so sure about. So maybe get in there and check it.
I'll check. And you guys, it's on a timer. So 15 minutes. So you don't have a whole lot of time per question. So make sure you don't take a coffee break while the quiz is running or it'll lock you out. Okay. Also, in order to give you an extra credit question that was not timed, I've created a second quiz and I literally finished that at 9:25, George, so you'll need to get back in there. But it's an extra credit, one question, picture, and you can use any resources you want. So your field guides, internet, whatever. The clues, I wrote them in there, Laurie State Park right after snow melt, kind of on a bench coming out of the mountains. So all I want on that is down to like a common name of a group of species. All right. So I need a species, like it's not deer, but you could put deer. That's what I mean by common name of a group. All right. So what left those marks? I think we only have a couple of those quizzes left, thank goodness. So I'll be working on making those. Next week, we have a guest speaker on Monday. So we'll try this again on Monday. This guy, Noe, was great. This guy is also a fantastic speaker. He is a biologist with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, and he studies bats. And through email yesterday, he said, oh, I could even show you guys some stuff I normally can't show because of software on his computer. So hopefully we'll be able to make that work. And I'm curious, could you guys hear Noe's birds when she was playing those? Okay, I think I better work with our bat biologist so we can hear his stuff. I have a feeling it's because the WebEx is only picking up the microphone audio and not the computer audio. So I'll try and figure that out before Monday. Couple more things, sorry, but it's really nice to have all of your attention and know that you actually I can get communication out to you. So you had a lot of stuff due last week. Whew, I know, good job, all right? Most of you have your stuff in. There are still quite a few of you missing the lab that was due Monday, of going out and doing just what she's saying. Just go find animal sign, right? That is one of the major goals of this class. And quite honestly, if you can't get to the specific habitats that I'm telling you to go to, just find the next best thing. Get yourself far away from other people. You know, try to obey the rules. Like if it's an off trail, you know, if you're not supposed to be off trail, but otherwise, whatever. Just go find some animal sign. There's going to be at least one, maybe two more labs like that. And it looks like I'm going to call you guys out. I don't have them from the following people, and you're online now, so make sure you get those in or email me if you can't, if there's some reason why it's not working. So Tyler, I see you. Walter, I see you. And Jacob Braun, I see you. And there's a few more, but I don't think. Make sure you get those in. This week, you had the lab via the quiz tool. Give me feedback on that kind of stuff. I don't know. It took me an insane amount of time to create that. I think it should take you a good solid hour to do if you're actually trying to learn the species. You can probably click through it really fast and try and get a good grade and try it a couple times and it not take very long, but put some effort into trying to learn it. You're not in the classroom looking at our poor specimen mounts, of which I did take pictures of everything in that classroom before they kicked us off the campus for good. So maybe I'll throw some extra pictures up there and say, what is it? And see how good you do. I don't know. We'll see how much time I have. Question. Otherwise, this week you had a lot. Last week you had a lot. Next week, you just have that guest speaker and quiz. So kind of take a breather, work on your species profiles. Most of you have traded. I've gone through and graded everyone on here except for Lisa's at this point, and I'll do that today, Lisa. And I've given you guys feedback in the assignment folder, so check that out. All right. Okay, any other questions? What's working, what's not working? Anything?
Yeah, I got a question. With that waterfowl lab, is there any way to review what we got wrong on the lab for future attempts on that? Because I was using all the resources and I couldn't, and I ended up not doing as well as I thought I did, and I'm not sure what sections were the issues.
Sure. I haven't looked at those at all. So let me kind of look through them, but I can go back in after the fact and change the settings so that you can view questions that you got wrong, and where you missed points. So I'll do that.
Perfect.
I did set up those first two ID as all or nothing, just to make you have a little more pressure to spend time getting them right. And then when I took the quiz and got a 60% right after making it, I went ahead and changed some questions and pictures. So hopefully it's a little bit better than it was. Also on that though, you did what, I'll do that today. And I don't know, I need to look and see. I don't want to do that before don't want to do it so that you could take it once, see what you missed, and then just take it again and get them right. So I might have to wait until the lab closes, which would be next week. But after that point, if you guys are like, I am not seeing why I missed that, please email me, and or we could start a discussion on things like, well, how can you tell a sage grouse from a dusky grouse, and what am I looking for? I'd be happy to kind of point some of that stuff out. And your quiz over birds is next Wednesday, so if you have concerns over that, send me an email, or I'll just start a discussion thread on it and post a discussion, and that way everyone can peek in and see what questions other people had. Any other questions, you guys?
Speaking about the discussions, I went back to try to look more at the low elevation lab discussion. That's still available.
Hey, Jesse, it's cutting out and I can't hear you. Can you type it in the chat?
Looks like you're muted, Jesse.
I think she's using the chat, maybe. Yeah, there we go. Oh. So you're not able to see other people's labs? I'll go check the settings on that, because that's one of the things I'd really like, is for you guys to be able to watch each other's stuff. So I'll see what I can figure out on that. And Jesse, I may email back and forth with you a little bit so you can help me check it. I gotta admit, guys, in real life world instead of virtual world, I don't ever use that discussion tool in D2L, because when I was a student, I hated having to respond to discussions. We're kind of stuck with that a little bit, because I can't think of any other way other than having these live things that doesn't work for everybody. So I'll minimize it, but we're a little bit stuck with the discussion tool in order to communicate with each other. But it also is the tool in D2L that I know the least. So when there's problems in there, please let me know, because I'm new to it. And yours was the very first one I used post-COVID. Our worlds, right? Pre-COVID, de-COVID, during, and P again, I guess. I don't know. All right. Anything else? Kevin, I like your dog.
Appreciate it. She likes it. She likes hanging out with us.
Oh, look at that. My dog busted in partway through, and that lets all my warm air out.
Yeah.
Okay, gang.
Cool.
So Monday, same thing. If this didn't work or there were problems, let me know. This will get posted to D2L later today, if you want to go back. And there will be a content question from her lecture today on the next quiz. All right. Okay, I'll hang out for a little bit if anyone has any particular questions, so you guys can just X yourselves out and enjoy the sunshine today. It'd be a great day to do that lab if you haven't done it yet.
See you guys.
Walter, do you have any questions?